Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about Elizabeth Holmes. Her trial has now started, so she's been going into court and the opening statements have been heard now. So the reason she's going to court is she claimed to have invented a machine that could test people's blood and just tiny samples of it. So the reason this was supposed to be a really good thing was that it meant people didn't have to have a large needle inserted, they didn't have to have multiple jabs. The results were supposed to be given to the patients very quickly. This little machine was supposed to do everything that a lab would usually do. It turned out, according to people who had worked for Elizabeth Holmes, that this machine wasn't doing what Elizabeth said it was doing. So actually she was using a lab to do all of the tests. She wasn't using the machine that she said she was using. And because such tiny samples were taken, she was apparently instructing people to add water to each sample, which meant that the tests weren't accurate. So according to the prosecution, she defrauded investors by millions, even billions of dollars. Her company was worth $9 billion when all of this came to light. From what I understand, the argument for the defense is that she was apparently in an abusive relationship, which meant she didn't realize her machine didn't work. It'll be interesting to hear how her lawyers explain the logic of that. Let's just suppose that she was lying when she was saying that it was working. Let's suppose that she was aware of all of this and have a look, and and I'm saying that to try to include the possibility that she wasn't lying, to be, I guess, more than anything politically correct, because I'm quite convinced she was because of all of the evidence. But anyway, let's suppose that she was lying so that we can have a look at her facial expression. I think it's interesting the way she looks when she's saying things that are really important to people. They're life or death topics.
People don't even know that they have a basic human right to be able to get access to information about themselves and their own bodies that can change their lives.
Her eyes remind me of the eyes on a snake character in a Disney film. The snake Disney is, the creatures in Disney, I think they're amazing. They're so good at capturing personality traits, and this snake was trying to be mesmerizing with his eyes, and he was basically hypnotizing someone to do something that he wanted him to do.
Go to sleep, please go to sleep. Sleep, little man, cub, rest in peace.
Look, there's no use arguing anymore. Now, no more talk till the morning.
He won't be here in the morning.
No, yes, he will. Car! Hold it, car!
And this, when I look at her eyes, they look similar. It looks like she's completely detached from talking about something that's happened, talking about a reality or a memory. She seems to be, and I don't know if you can see that in her eyes, but they look to me to be empty, as if she's putting her focus on the effect she wants to have on people rather than on the topic she's talking about. When you see someone talking about a topic that they know about, they can look focused on the subject that they're talking about. Their eyes can look a lot clearer. But if they're just focused on how they're coming across, there's something different going on in their expression.
It's finding what you're born to do. When you really give everything to that, then you can realize great things.
If you think about how important this topic is, again, to the people who are listening, that they have a right to know about their own bodies, a human right, as she says, rather than thinking about the people she's talking about those lives that could be saved, because she knows that this whole thing isn't possible. I think her focus is on how impressive all of this sounds. And so while these statements might trigger empathy in most people, they don't seem to be triggering it in her. Because if she had empathy, I don't think she would be able to say a statement like this with her expression looking so undisturbed as it does. Because you really are talking about people's lives and deaths here.
Theranos means being able to see the onset of disease in time to be able to do something about it.
Yet she's very comfortable with making these statements because she knows that they will get lots of positive attention and sound just really impressive. And that's where her focus is, not on what she's saying or the people that this would actually really affect in real life.
There are people in this world who revolutionize our lives: Coco Chanel, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Walt Disney, and Elizabeth Holmes. Mark my words.
I think having her name right up there with all of these successful, famous people's names would have been a dream come true for Elizabeth Holmes. I think most of us are quite happy not to have our names up there. We don't want to be the next Bill Gates or Walt Disney. So why would Elizabeth Holmes want that so much? Why is this going to be so important to her? Well, a narcissist's identity is tied up in how people view them, and that really is all their identity is. And the reason for this is that there was something missing early on in life that they never got, that they're still trying to get all the way through their adult lives. A psychiatrist who was a friend of the family, he's talked about how Elizabeth was emotionally withdrawn as a child and always pulled to the side in photos. That sounds like the opposite to what happened when she was an adult, you know, where she was centre stage, where she was completely in the limelight, always the centre of attention. Everyone was really impressed by her. So that already gives us a clue about what might have been missing for her in her childhood. Were her parents really focused on her? Was that important to them? Was she really heard? Why did she crave being heard so much and being focused on so much that she needed to be the star, you know, that she really needed to do anything and everything to be the name on everyone's lips? This psychiatrist mentioned that he spoke Arabic and that he had all these different inventions that he was making money from at the same time as seeing his patients. So he came up with different patents, and that was a good income for him. And he said that the family were always jealous of him. He said that his children and Elizabeth and her younger brother grew up together, so they knew them really well. And apparently, according to him, Elizabeth's mum wanted her to be like him. She wanted Elizabeth to learn a language and to be an inventor. And he actually said to her, just let her be what she'll be. Don't try and push her into something. And obviously that didn't work. He describes her parents as very interested in status and as people who lived for connections. It sounds like her mother's outlook was very narcissistic, that it was so important what other people thought of her and her family, and that her daughter needed to be this perfect, impressive person, as, you know, through her eyes. And it wasn't important to her to have a real connection with her daughter. That's the sense I get just from this little example. Because if it had been, then I would expect that she would want to know who her daughter wanted to turn out to be, you know, what kinds of things her daughter was excited about and wanted to learn more about, instead of deciding all of this for her. At the age of 9, Elizabeth wrote a letter to her dad, and she said in it that what she really wanted out of life was to discover something new, something that mankind didn't know was possible to do. So it seems that what her mum wanted her to be was already rubbing off on her when she was in primary school, and that the pressure from her mum was already so strong that Elizabeth couldn't distinguish between what her mum wanted and what she wanted. Her mum had apparently sent Elizabeth to Stanford summer school to try to get her in through a back door. She'd heard that that was an easier way to get somebody into Stanford if they went along to a summer program. So Elizabeth went to the Stanford summer school program in China and learnt Mandarin. And back then, that was, that was the new language that everyone was starting to learn, because China's economy was doing better and better, and people were sensing that that might be the future. So it made sense for her to learn that language. It was obviously really impressive because it's a notoriously hard language to learn. Fwiz said that when she was there, she was really unhappy. She called home and crying, and saying that the hotel was really dirty and she wanted to come home, and her mum wouldn't let her. And not only that, but her mother didn't want to speak to her. She wanted Fwitz's wife to speak to her instead. So that gives us an idea of how, if she wasn't going to even listen to her feelings, that wasn't as important as Elizabeth's success. What she wanted didn't matter as much as this impressive language she was learning. And she didn't want to listen to her and comfort her herself. She wanted somebody else to deal with this. So that also says a lot about their relationship and about the way that her mother would respond to her. Fwiz says that she wasn't particularly academic, that she didn't really have amazing grades when she was at school, but she did manage to get into Stanford, but only lasted 2 semesters, and then she dropped out. At this point, her dad put her in front of an influential venture capitalist, and this guy was really impressed because he heard her speaking Mandarin in the background when she was on the phone. Not only that, but apparently her appearance had a big impact on some of these middle-aged men who were investing in her. And she was charming. She had a lot of charisma. Because she was supposedly not that academic, I wonder if when she got into Stanford, she'd then, she'd achieved getting in, so that was really successful and impressive. That was something that her mum could tell everyone about, and she could feel good about that. But then when she was actually at Stanford, I wonder if maybe she started to feel a bit mediocre, or even a bit at the bottom, because there would have been a lot of really bright students around her. So maybe at that point it became really hard to tolerate being quite an unimpressive person compared to many of them. And I wonder if that's why she ended up dropping out.
One of the first to hear her future business plans was Stanford University Professor of Medicine, Dr. Phyllis Gardner. Unlike most who encountered Holmes, Dr. Gardner was not impressed. Did Elizabeth Holmes always have big dreams, in your opinion?
Absolutely. Her ambition was over the top. She had no knowledge of medicine and a rudimentary knowledge of engineering, and she was 19. And she really didn't want any expertise. She thought she knew it all.
She's said since that she dropped out in order to fund her new business. And that is what ended up happening, but there wasn't really a product there to begin with. So my feeling is that she dropped out in order to become a superstar again. She had been a superstar by getting in, and now the next step was to be at the top. And she couldn't be at the top in Stanford, so she was going to be at the top outside of there. No one was going to be her boss. She was going to be her own boss, and she was going to be the director of a company, so she could feel successful again. And if she could get all of these impressive people to believe in her, then that would impress her mum as well. This really was her mother's dream that she was trying to fulfill. And it's just interesting how hollow all of this is, because there wasn't a product. It's a really good metaphor and a good example for how narcissists tend to think. It's not about anything of substance. It's just about people being impressed with them, or people being, thinking of them as powerful, exceptional people. And that's really all that matters. The people who really are powerful and exceptional get there because they're so focused on what they're doing. Their focus isn't on trying to be seen in a great light. But it seems that Elizabeth Holmes really needed to get there. She needed to get into that position. She needed to be at the top. She needed to be thought of as really impressive. But she didn't have the capability of actually creating a product that would naturally get her there. She didn't have the education yet or the experience yet to be able to come up with something like that. It's apparently really hard. It apparently takes years to come up with one blood test that is successful in a laboratory. So if she's doing multiple blood tests from using a tiny pinprick in a tiny machine, I mean, the whole thing was the kind of thing that would take many years to develop if it was to actually work. And I think that it would have been, in order to create something like that, you'd have to have a lot of patience with yourself. You'd have to be able to fail multiple times in order to finally come up with something that did the trick, which they still haven't come up with now. So, and I think that she would have struggled with that, because if your only purpose is to succeed, and without that you feel like you're nothing, then how would you be able to tolerate failing over and over again every time you make a mistake on your way to finally getting something right? So for that reason, a lot of narcissists don't actually do particularly well. So there's this real pressure that a narcissist feels to be someone, to be recognized as impressive, and that comes before how anyone else feels. I think for Elizabeth Holmes, it would have been a must. You know, nobody wants to be caught out and publicly humiliated, as she's now going to experience, that shame of everybody talking about you as being a liar and fraudulent. Nobody wants to be shown up in that way. But I think she did it because she was desperate. And that's not excusing what she did. But I think that she was such a young woman, she was just 21. In fact, she was only 19 when all of this began. And I think that more than anything, she wanted to be the impressive person that her mum had decided she needed to be. Being that person would be the closest thing she could imagine, I think, to being loved. In order to impress these investors, she talked about her successful relatives. It actually worked. People really did think, oh, well, that explains it then, it's in the genes. She's so young, she has so little experience and not much education at uni because she's dropped out, but now we understand that it's in her genes. So that's how she knows so much about what she's doing. She knew what they were successful at, almost like it was off by heart, as if her mum had drummed it into her over and over again, and she knew she needed to live up to this, and now she needed to be that person too. And I imagine that there was a lot of magical thinking going on, that it wasn't so much that she thought, oh, this is a big lie I'm telling everyone because I can't possibly do the things I'm saying I can do, but more that she thought, yeah, I am going to be that person. This is going to happen, and I'm going to say it's happening now, because if I believe it enough, it's going to happen. I have to be this person because this is an impressive person, and if I'm not this person, I'm no one. The story of Elizabeth Holmes reminds me of The Emperor's New Clothes, a story I was told when I was a child. And funnily enough, I actually heard someone else mention this in relation to Elizabeth Holmes on a documentary I watched recently about it. And this is something that I often think of when I see the way that narcissists can live in their fantasy world and be convinced of it because they need to be, and they need everyone around them to also be convinced that this complete delusion is reality. And so they're then surrounded by flying monkeys who will hurt others and tread on others and make up stories about others, spread smear campaigns in order to forward this fantasy, and make it if they all believe it, then maybe it is real. So you can often see that in, for example, the family of a narcissist, where one of the parents is a narcissist and the rest of the family all need to go along with this fantasy world created by that person. You know, so they all need to believe that this person, for example, was really successful and, you know, the most successful at whatever career they were involved in. And if they didn't make it, it was someone else's fault. That's an example, you know, of one of these fantasy worlds. Or they need to believe that whoever doesn't like this parent has some kind of mental health problem, and that's why, you know, their thinking is completely faulty and so it's their fault, or they're jealous of them, and so on. And so everyone goes along with this fantasy, and often you might find that they don't actually believe it, but they need to act like they do, because otherwise they're going to be the enemy. You know, they're going to be targeted by the narcissist and the rest of the family. So in this case, there was this really impressive company that everybody was talking about, that was headed by this genius superstar young girl that everyone was really impressed with. Only it didn't actually do anything that it said it did. It was useless. It got in people's way, you know, that there were people on medication that didn't need to be on medication because of the false results of the blood tests. The lack of any substance in Theranos also reminds me of how in a relationship with a narcissist, there can be this promise of love. Just as Elizabeth Holmes promised these amazing effects on people's health, the love that you wait for in a relationship with a narcissist never comes. So you get glimpses of it, or what seems to be it, when you're love bombed, but you never really get the real thing. And the whole relationship is about waiting for the promises to actually turn into something real. So the company did absolutely nothing, but everybody had to pretend it did. Everybody had to pretend it was a miracle, and people really did believe it. And I think that looking at this and watching how the media responded and how all of these big names responded can be really helpful if you're feeling like you're an idiot for believing in a narcissist's lies in the past. You know, if you bought into their persona and you kick yourself later and think, why didn't I just see them for who they were? What was wrong with me? Well, look at all these people who were fooled by Elizabeth Holmes. Narcissists will go out of their way to convince you that their fantasy world is real because they need to believe it themselves so badly. And when you need something that badly for yourself that your whole identity relies on it, then you will be pretty believable when you're convincing other people. So I'm going to leave it here. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.